Welcome back to the JX. I'm Mike Green. Here's Chelsea Rose with Oregon's Underground History.
You're listening to Underground History, a collaboration between Jefferson Public Radio and the Southern Oregon University Laboratory of Anthropology, or SULA. I'm your host, Chelsea Rose, and each episode we take a deep dive into little-known aspects of history in Oregon and beyond. And my guest today is no stranger to Oregon's underground history. Public historian Finn J.D. John, author of Offbeat Oregon, Wicked Portland, and most recently, Bad Ideas and Horrible People of Old Oregon, is joining us on the line. Finn, thanks for hopping on the show to talk about Oregon's quirky past.
Hi, Chelsea. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, so let's start off with how you became the unofficial, or I guess maybe official at this point, historian of Oregon's scandals and swindles and all things silly. Did you come across some really weird story that led you down this path, or is this just where your destiny was going to take you to kind of chronicle these things?
Well, it's kind of interesting. I don't think there's anything official about it. It's basically a hobby that just kind of lurched wildly off the rails and took off on its own. But about 12 years ago, I left my job and went back to the university to get a graduate degree. And I wanted to have a franchise, something that I could develop my skills with. And so I sort of hit on this Oregon history thing. The first thought that came to my mind was, of course, the exploding whale.
Yeah. And, I was going through this book, your most recent book, and there are just so many fun vignettes of all these really weird things. Some things I knew a little bit about, of course, the exploding whale, which is everybody's favorite, but also Oregon's Atlantis, the Bay Ocean. And then I'd never even heard of Pixie Land near Lincoln City. And, there's a lot of coast-based ones. So is there something in the water over there that's really prompting a lot of bad ideas?
I'm not really sure, but as I was looking through the geography of the Bad Ideas and Horrible People book, I noticed that there was a lot of stuff on the coast. But that may just be the exploding whale effect, because that really is just a wonderful story. Pixieland story is great, too, because the interesting thing that I find fascinating about Pixieland is it's such a demonstration of what Oregon's culture was like, before the music stopped, before they ran out of trees to cut, before the money stopped coming in.
Do you want to just give a quick little overview of what Pixieland was for folks who don't know what it was or what it was meant to be?
Sure. So the way that they pitched it was as a sort of a fairy tale history of Oregon. And it came out, I think it's also something that I hadn't really noticed until very recently, was that Pixieland was developed about 8 years after the centennial celebration, which was very focused around, Oregon history and progress and the golden future and nuclear energy that's going to get rid of all the smog. But Pixieland it got started basically as a restaurant called the Pixie Kitchen in Lincoln City. And it was a wonderful restaurant. One of my earliest childhood memories is visiting it and looking at myself in they had funhouse mirrors for people who were waiting for a seat. But it was great food, and there was lots of it. It was sort of an all-you-can-eat thing. And they had this Pixies theme to it. They had an artist who painted these little pixie characters all around, and there was a railroad train that ran in the courtyard, and the kids could watch it. And the owners of the restaurant decided that they would go ahead and hire someone who had been involved with Disneyland to create basically a Disneyland at the Oregon coast themed around Oregon history. And it was very similar to the expo in 1959, Centennial Expo, because it had a little train that went around, and there were rides that you could ride on. The big one was a logging flume ride, which sounds like it would be a good idea until you think about what the weather is usually like at the coast. I mean, who's going to really want going down a log flume thing like at Disneyland? It's called Splash Mountain, I think.
Uh-huh.
I've ridden on it, and I got wet. And I loved it because it was Anaheim, and it was 90 degrees outside. When it's 45 degrees and it's got one of those lovely coastal mists where you're look straight up and the sky is blue, but it's foggy all around, that's great weather for not being on the log flume.
Yeah. So was that really the clincher? The bad idea part was just the weather was just never going to make it successful. You had 5 really awesome days a year.
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, people have to be able to plan a visit to a theme park like that.
Yeah.
You can take vacation time and stuff like that. And then And then you grab the dice and the weather dice and throw them on the table or on the I think they call it a craps pit. You take your chances and you show up, and if it's drizzling, you have to figure out something else to do.
Yeah.
So it just never made enough money to fly.
How many years was it open for?
4.
4 years. That's it.
Yeah.
Oh,
Governor
wow.
McCall dedicated it, and it was a really cool concept, though. I wish I had been old enough to experience it, through lucid eyes, which I was too young at that time. But they partnered with the Dairygold folks to have it like a cheese cave and an ice cream stand. They had an Old West Village kind of thing that you could walk through. Their little blacksmith shop and stuff like that. Best of all, there was an opera house that they built, and they were staging vaudeville acts there.
Wow.
Which I would love to be able to have seen something like that. Mustache twirling villains and Dudley Do-Right types riding in on their horses and whatnot.
So the archaeologist in me is wondering what happened to it. Is the cheese cave still there, or is it just
No.
It's all gone?
Okay, so what happened with that is they built it on the Salmon River estuary. They basically diked it off, pumped out all the water, and built the park there. Well, obviously, that's wetland that was needed for salmon smolts and whatnot. And so as soon as the Forest Service started trying to protect Cascade Head, they started looking at this amusement park and like, who said those guys could build there? They should not have ever built there. And so as the park started to decline, they started sort of putting pressure on them to, release it back into the wild. And that eventually did happen. There were some bad feelings about it on the part of the Pixieland folks who kind of felt like they were bums rushed out, but there's no sign of it anymore. It's back to estuary.
Well, that's probably, I guess, a good thing. You're listening to Underground History on the Jefferson Exchange. You can find us online at jeffexchange.org. I'm your host, Chelsea Rose, and today I am joined by Finn J.D. John, Chronicle of Oregon's Quirky Past, and we're talking about Pixieland, but also Bay Ocean. So there would be archaeology for that in the underwater, right?
I should think so. Actually, one of my fantasy ideas is getting the opportunity to purchase one of the Bay Ocean lots that is underwater.
Call me when you do. We'll get some scuba gear and go take a look.
But it would just be a cool certificate to have on the wall. Not that you could do anything with it. Now, Jerry Sutherland came out with a book about it fairly recently, and he's been making the rounds and giving talks, and he probably knows more about it than me because he's gone and researched and produced an entire book. I believe it's called Oregon's Atlantis, the Bay Ocean story.
And I think there's an Oregon Public Broadcasting, I think they did Oregon Experience did a documentary or something. I think there's something like that about it.
Yes. I think Cammie Horton might have been involved with that.
Yeah, I think so.
But yes, the fascinating thing for me about the Bay Ocean story is I've seen the pictures of that little headland thing that they had there. It's 140 feet high. It had trees on it, and it looked like solid ground. And it just wore away.
Yeah.
And they kind of paid for their own destruction because they didn't want to pay for a full jetty to protect the entrance to Tillamook Bay. So I said, well, we'll just do half a jetty. And it just changed the currents, where the currents started scouring out.
Oh, it was even worse.
Yeah.
Oh, geez. So you have a section in the book on some of our infamous horrible people in Oregon, and it kind of reminds me of a more ironic version of Fred Lockley's work. I'm sure you must be familiar with his books.
Yeah.
Yes. So, and he's got lots of horrible people and bad ideas too in those pioneer biographies, but they're presented as heroes and visionaries. And I really think that that's one of the things that really makes your work really cool, is that you're framing it a little bit different and not really falling into a lot of these tropes that really celebrate a lot of the settler colonialism. And instead you are kind of like giving a more nuanced version of some of these stories that everybody's familiar with. So is that intentional?
Well, I think it's a matter of conscience, really, Chelsea, because we can't go back. Innocence, cultural innocence, once it's lost, it's gone, and we have to work with what we've got. So it would be disingenuous of me to pretend I was Fred Lockley writing in, 1951. And, Golden West, let's homestead this place after we kick the Indians off of it or whatever. It just doesn't play. And yet there it is in history. So I think it's super important to get into a space where we respect the intentions of people who were working with incomplete information and said and did some pretty awful things.
Yeah.
And that doesn't excuse them from being called horrible people because,
Yeah. And I know that it was Mike something is who compiled a lot of those into like Mule Skinners, and there's Pioneer Women. There's a bunch of volumes of that, but there are like actual archives of all those original interviews Lockley has done somewhere. Have you seen those?
I have not, but I would love to.
Yeah, I've always thought that'd be fun to go through there. Yeah, I look at those books all the time, not at face value, but there is a lot of like hidden information in there, who was where, who was doing what in the early days. So they are still good, even though, the heroes of yesterday are a little bit more problematic when thought about today.
One of the most fun things about doing this weird history stuff is finding the places where people like Fred Lockley and Stuart Holbrook were blinded by, their zeitgeist and blinded by their prejudices, and told a story which they thought they understood, but which unlocks insights that they completely overlooked.
Yeah. And do you have a favorite Oregon bad guy? Like, is there a mascot of like just the worst guy that we should be embarrassed of or even in awe of how horrible he was?
Well, I have a favorite one, I think. And then I have one who's so much worse that I just kind of can't. Our state supervillain was Major General Charles H. Martin, governor of Oregon, and the guy who created a program for the United States Army after World War I to degrade and humiliate an entire cohort of returning war heroes so that they would not get uppity because they were black people. The Army didn't want black people to start asserting themselves as war heroes, which is what they were. So he created this whole program. It's like one of the darkest and most embarrassing things in United States military history. And he was our governor for a little while. There's also the Shanghaiers. And the Shanghaiers were awful.
And those are true, because I always thought the Portland-Shanghai tunnels was just all myth.
Well, yeah. And that's kind of the conventional wisdom among pop historians like me, is that the Shanghai tunnels were just something that Mike Jones made up. But I'm not sure that's the case, because there is some anecdotal evidence that those basement systems were used to capture people to be shanghaied. And also Mike Jones made his chops working for something called Transit Bank. It was the world's first hobo bank, is the way he presented it. So he had, homeless guys that were traveling, right? And they could make deposits with Transit Bank, and then that way they weren't having to try to defend their money when they were out on the road, riding the rails and stuff like that. So Mike Jones got a lot of stories from people who were, homeless guys, hobos, basically.
Yeah.
And it really makes sense to me that there would have been pressure to Shanghai homeless guys. I think that there may be some truth to the Shanghai tunnel stories. I don't think they were used to transport people to the waterfront. That would just be unnecessary. You could be helping an unconscious sailor back to his ship, and it would look just like somebody getting shanghaied out of the Valhalla Saloon or whatever. But I do think they were used.
Wow. Well, there is so much more we could talk about. Good thing you wrote a book so listeners can follow up and look you up. So the new book is Bad Ideas and Horrible People of Old Oregon. Thank you so much, Finn, for joining me on the show today.
Yes, thank you, Chelsea. It's delightful to be here.
This wraps up this round of Underground History on the Jefferson Exchange. I'm your host, Chelsea Rose, and our show producers are Angela Decker and Charlie Zimmerman. You can find this episode and many more at jeffexchange.org or wherever you get your podcasts.
That's it for today's JX segments. jeffexchange.org is our website where you can find these conversations and more. Or you can subscribe to our shows wherever you get your broadcasts. I'm Mike Green. Angela Decker is our senior producer, and Zach Beagle is engineering our show. Thanks for joining us, and have a nice day.